is the Greece and the Greeks, the Eastern Mediterranean and the wider Mediterranean. These are the options that we're left with. So let's have a look at the Greek Macedonian hypothesis. This identification is explicitly made in the book of Maccabees. And in there, it's the very first verse of the very first chapter. It says, after Alexander, son of Philip, the Macedonian, who came from the land of QUITIM, had defeated King Darius of the Persians and the Medes, he succeeded him as king, and he had previously become king of Greece. Okay? Now, this statement is dated to the 2nd century BC. That's earlier than Josephus by 200 years. Now, I'll just show you the timeline. So if we go back to this timeline, look how early that one goes. And I'm going to show this one quickly for comparison. The circumstantial evidence, well, it's not really circumstantial, it's more archaeological and linguistic evidence, will take us almost within 2 centuries of Moses. Within 2 centuries of Moses. So let's go through and have a look at that. So the Greek connection. In the book of Genesis, now this is what Josephus was commenting on, we've got what's called the Table of Nations. It's all of the nations that descended from Noah. And out of the branch of the family, which is Japheth, we had one of Japheth's sons was Javan, and of Javan's sons we had four children. There was Elishah, Tarshish, Kittim, and Dodanim. From these, the coastland peoples spread in their lands, each with his own language, by their clans in their nations. Okay, so you can get an idea where there's a narrow meaning and then there's a wider meaning. There's the narrow meaning of there's these four people groups, and then there's the whole coastlands are kind of known by these. They're spread out amongst these coastlands. Now, Javan is connected to the Ionians or the Greeks. In Hebrew, it would be Yawan, which is very similar to Ionian, and that's a very common link there. Now then, Elishah, as we've seen, is associated with Cyprus or Alashia. Dodanim has been associated with the Dodonai, or the Dodonoi, which, has anyone heard of Troy, the Battle of Troy? Okay, so the Trojans were also known as Dodonoi, or Dardanians. And after the Battle of Troy, they moved into the Balkans area. So they were in the lower Balkans around Albania way. Now, I haven't mentioned the Tarshish. Tarshish, I do have a bit on my paper on it, but it's a little bit superfluous to what we're talking about today. I had to cut it out. It's a fascinating one. There's no real consensus on where Tarshish is. Some evidence seems to point to Cilicia, which is in lower Turkey. Other evidence seems to point to, like, Spain. So it's probably a bit of both. It's probably something that had a narrow meaning and then expanded outwards, which we'll see with QUITIM. Now, QUITIM and Troy. Now, Homer mentions one of the groups that were allied with the Mysians in the Battle of Troy. So in the Battle of Troy, if you read Homer's Iliad, it has the whole Battle of Troy with a lot of mythological exaggeration. But in there, it has all of the people that were on this side and all the people who are on that side. Now, the Battle of Troy has been understood to have happened, the ruins of Troy have been dated to about 1250 BC. So that's about 200 years distant from Moses. We're almost there. Now, these Ketaeans are therefore the earliest known people group to have the Kati sound in their name. And they're also from the area we would expect, because we're expecting it to be around the Greek area, because Javan is the word for the Greeks. Remember, every time you read the word, even in the chapter Daniel 11, whenever you read the word Greek, it's Javan. You can see where Troy is in the map. That's the area of the kingdom of Troy. And next to it was Mysia. And so the Ketaeans had to be somewhere close. I'm proposing that it's in this area which we would call Macedon. That's what the Maccabees text says, that it's from Macedonia. So let's have a look at some other evidence. The Greek for Macedonia is Makedones. The archaic or alternative form of this is Makatai. Now, I want you to do a d sound. Everyone, d, 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 d. Now say t, 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 t. So one of these are both known as aliovela stops, and one of them is voiced and the other one is unvoiced. D is the the voiced, and t is the unvoiced. And so it's actually common in the pre-Roman languages for there to be a bit of evolution between d and t. In my wife Alina's language, they actually have in-between sounds as well. They have d, so there's d, t, and d. So there's a lot of evolution there. But doesn't Makatai have the same syllables we'd be looking, so the same sounds we'd be looking for? Makatai? It's got the k, t, y in there. The Macedonians had a complicated history with the Greeks from the south. Okay, they were considered kin. They were able to participate in the Olympic Games, but not really considered to be part of the pure Greeks. They were considered barbarians. So they were a pre-existing people. They were Greeks, but they weren't necessarily Greeks, because when the Heraclidae, that's the supposed descendants of Heracles, you might know him as Hercules, by the Roman name Hercules. When the descendants of Hercules, or the Dorians, came in to attack the Peloponnese, and I'll show a map of that. So the Peloponnese is this area, the bottom peninsula there. Can you see the bottom peninsula in Greece? That's the Peloponnese. And so when the Dorians came to attack that at the collapse of the Bronze Age, some of them, it got too crowded, so some of them moved up north into Macedonia, and they conquered a people that was already there called the Macedonians, according to many sources. And in Macedon, you had certain other place names, like there was a town called QUITIM. Now, some dispute that this ever existed. No evidence has been found of what this QUITIM is, but there is one source that mentions a town called QUITIM in Macedonia. And there's also a famous mountain where they would hunt lions back when lions were in Europe. And that's in Mount Kitos, which is near Thessaloniki. Okay, so QUITIM is, as we've seen in other places of the Bible, let's see if it fits Greece. Now, some of it's going to be a bit more ambiguous than others, but QUITIM in Isaiah 23 is one of several places that were to take up a lament over the prophesied destruction of Tyre. Tyre was the Phoenician capital, and it extended its influence over the entire Mediterranean. And the prophecy of Isaiah 23 is that the nations of the Mediterranean take up a lament over the destruction that's coming to Tyre, because when Tyre gets destroyed, it's going to interrupt the entire economy of the Mediterranean. So you see Egypt is mentioned, Tarshish is mentioned, and QUITIM is also mentioned. So QUITIM is mentioned in this prophecy as a place where the Tyrians may have tried to escape to. Now, if you're going to escape from coming destruction, do you hop over just over a little way over the horizon to a nearby location like Cyprus, or do you want to get out of Dodge? Okay, I would be wanting to get out of Dodge. It implies to me that they're wanting to escape to a far distant place that they might be safe from the destruction. But there's no clear textual indication to pinpoint where QUITIM is in this text. But there is, so that's a bit of a map of all of the Phoenician colonies. They did have colonies in the upper Aegean, upper Greek Sea there. And this is the trade routes. So they had trade with the Greeks. There's heaps of artifacts that have been found, Greek artifacts in Palestine, and Syrian artifacts or Phoenician artifacts in Greece. So they had the trade routes to back up the idea that there might have been a distant QUITIM. But Jeremiah is a bit stronger. Well, it's even stronger in Ezekiel. Jeremiah just says this. It doesn't have a lot of connection geographically, but it gives a bit of an indication of what we're talking about. It says, for cross to the coasts of QUITIM and see, or send to Kedar and examine with care. See if there has ever been such a thing. Has a nation changed its gods, even though there are no gods? But my people have changed their glory for that which does not profit. And in Jeremiah, the idea is these pagan nations are more faithful to their gods than you are to me. And he uses two place names. He uses Kedar and he uses QUITIM. Now, Kedar were a nomadic tribe in the desert area of Arabia. Okay, so that was to the east. And the QUITIM we know was to the west somewhere. But it wasn't a close tribe, it wasn't close by, it was in the far desert, this Kedar. And so what we've got is a bit of a double merism here. Now, does anyone know what a merism is? If I say east and west, that's a merism. It's like everything in between. If I say hot and cold, it's everything in between. If I was to say heavens and earth, That's everything, so in Genesis, God created the heavens and the earth. That's everything. Now, QUITIM and Kedar is a double merism. It represents both east and west, and it represents desert and sea. Okay, so Kedar would be down into the Arabian desert, and QUITIM is somewhere but probably not as close as Cyprus, because it's somewhere distant, which is the idea here. Now, QUITIM is also in Ezekiel. It's in the same chapter we saw about those shells where they made the purple dye. So Elishah is in that chapter, and QUITIM is mentioned separately to Elishah. And now, in this chapter, Tyre is likened to a massive ship. Imagine like a colossus ship that takes up the entire Mediterranean. And all of these different place names are to supply different parts to make up the ship of Tyre, the ship of the Phoenicians. You've got Elishah, which provided the purple dye for their sails, probably. QUITIM is the source of pine inlaid with ivory. Okay, it says, they made your decks from pines from the coast of QUITIM, inlaid with ivory. Now, there weren't elephants in Greece, so could Greece have had ivory? Well, yes. Aegean tradesmen were known to have imported ivory from Egypt or from Syria, and then inlaid it. They were masters of inlaying wood with ivory, and then they would export it back. There's lots of artifacts from Greece that have been found in different places, including Cyprus, including Syria. And so they didn't just use elephant, they used hippopotamus. I was actually quite fascinated by that. They'd use hippopotamus teeth because they were easier to come by. So northern Greece or Macedonia had an abundance of pine trees. They weren't found so much in the south of Greece, but they were found in the north, where Macedonia is, in the Balkans, lower Balkans, the Alpine area. The oldest tree in Europe is actually from Macedonia. It's like 1,000 years old. It's pre-Vikings, and it's a pine tree in northern Greece. How cool is that? So the QUITIM, we're moving outside of the Bible now. Now, there were QUITIM mercenaries in Israel in at the time of Josiah, before Nebuchadnezzar came in and conquered Israel. So the Arad Ostraka from the late 7th century BC. Now, ostraka are like pottery shards that, they didn't have paper to write on, so they're broken pottery. They just scribble a note, go and feed this guy, go and send some supplies to this guy. And in about 10 of them, there's these mention of these QUITIM associated with Greek names. And in the same area, which is the Negev, the lower Israel desert, there is Greek pottery from the same period. So the QUITIM have been argued to be mercenaries, Greek mercenaries, who were fighting on behalf of Israel at that time. There's also a coastal encampment which had Greek artifacts, Phoenician artifacts, and Israeli artifacts. So there was like a combined army that was in that area. Now this one doesn't fit with Cyprus. There's not really any Cypriot artifacts in the same area from the same time period. So Greek is probably where these QUITIM are referred as being. There's also Greek QUITIM in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So the earlier Dead Sea Scrolls, while the later ones, we've mentioned the later ones, they refer to QUITIM as the Romans after 63 BC. The earlier ones identify them with the Macedonians. The War Scroll, for example, refers to the QUITIM of Ashur, which may be understood to be the Seleucids, because the Seleucids occupied the territory of Assyria, remember? So there's an unbroken line of evidence from Moses' time to the intertestamental period, that's the period between the Old and New Testaments, which points to a Greek or Macedonian QUITIM. Unbroken line, like it just goes all the way through. And now a wider application to the Aegean or Eastern Mediterranean occurred through the broadening of the geographical horizon. You start to associate narrow locations with the wider whole. So if you're watching the news and they're talking about the government in America making a decision, they'll say, Washington said, or if they're talking about Australia, they'll say Canberra, Canberra advised, because Canberra has become a metonym for the entire of Australia, and Washington DC is the entire America. And so QUITIM seems to have broadened to the idea of it's the far west, just like Tarshish, like we don't know exactly where it is. It's probably far west by the time of Jonah. He just wanted to get out of there. He wanted to go as far as he could away from what God was commanding him to do. And so Tarshish is like probably, if Tarshish is the western, like the far western Mediterranean, then the QUITIM would be the eastern Mediterranean under this sort of a broader geographical horizon. So let's compare the hypotheses before we move on to get to some of the meatier stuff. So we've got the Philistine hypotheses, the Hittite hypothesis. Those are very recent. They don't even touch anywhere near Moses' time. The Roman hypothesis gets us a bit closer. The Kition hypothesis gets us closer still, but the Macedonian hypothesis is where it's at. That's the one that gets us to within 2 centuries of Moses' time. So let's look at the one that I didn't mention, which is Balaam's apocalypse. Have you ever thought of Balaam as having an apocalypse? Everyone remembers Balaam, right? He talked to a donkey. We should all remember him here, especially at Kingscliff, because one of David Asherick's favourite sayings was that if God can speak through an ass, he can speak through an Asherick. Okay, so we know that one. So Balaam prophesied through 7 oracles. I actually thought it was 4 before I did this study, but it's actually 7. Each of them starts with the words, and he took up his oracle and said. So 7's a pretty significant number. It's got an idea of completion or wholeness. Now the number 7 features heavily in the narrative that surrounds these oracles. 3 of them, the first 3 oracles, Balak had to sacrifice 7 bulls and 7 rams on 7 altars. Okay? So these are more than mere prophecies. When you look at it, the word for oracle has an idea of exhortation. It's to exhort a response. And there's actually, Balak had some very strong responses to these oracles. They're built around a unified theme. Now, there's a progression, and the progression is on several levels. The first one is that the first 2 oracles, they come as a result of, he goes through this ritual. Balak sacrifices all these animals, and then Balaam goes away, consults his stones or whatever, his omens, and then he comes and gives an oracle. Now, the last 5, they don't go through this process. He doesn't go and consult the omens. He spontaneously, through the Spirit, he just gives an oracle. And then there's a progression in the kind of frustration levels of Balak and the surprise level of Balaam. Balaam is surprised himself. He wants to do what he's commissioned to do, but he can't do anything other than what God says. He wants to please Balak because Balak's getting frustrated. He's like, in one instance, Balak's like, don't curse them at all and don't bless them at all. Just don't say anything. We often say, if you don't have anything good to say, don't say it at all. Balak's idea was, if you don't have anything bad to say, don't say it at all. He wanted something bad about Israel. And then there's the linguistic progression through the exordia. Okay, the exordia, that's the exhortation part of the oracle. It starts off, he's addressing Balak directly. He's saying, Balak, this is about, this is to you. And then he moves from the third person, Balak, to the second person and says, you. And finally, Balak disappears from view altogether. He's not in there by name, he's not even there but referenced. So it's moving outward from Balaam and Balak's time out into the future. So Balaam's commission was to curse Israel. The word that he was supposed to do is found in the Abrahamic blessing, okay, where it says, "I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you, I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." Now, the Balaam situation narrative, it was a test of God's loyalty. It was a test of God's faithfulness to his own covenant. Because here it is, he's promised Abraham, if anyone curses you, I'm going to curse them. I'll bless those that bless you, but anyone who dishonors you, I'll curse them. And so what happens here is that Balaam is unable to curse Israel. He curses instead the Moabites. Now, there's a building messianic expectation in these oracles. The uniqueness of Israel is highlighted as a set-apart people. Okay, they're a people that are unique. They're not. It says the words in the first oracle are they can't be counted among the nations. Okay, they're unique. They're special. In describing Israel, it talks about the dust of Jacob, which is the word dust is the same word used in your descendants will be as many as the sand of the sea. It's the same word. And then there's Balaam. He wanted to be in on the promise. You know how it says, in you all the families of the earth will be blessed? Balaam saw this. He said, let me die the death of the upright and let my end be his. I want to be like Israel. There's a reference to a seed. This is also in the Abrahamic prophecies. And then there's also a reference to a scepter and a star. Abraham was promised that he would have kings amongst his descendants. And so there's a scepter and star that would arise out of Jacob. So it also moves from the local to the global. In the first two oracles, it mentions the nation that they've just come from. You've just come from Egypt, and they're about to establish their own place in Israel, in Canaan. And so it mentions the local politics that they would have. It mentions the Edomites and the Moabites that would be foes to them. Now, Moab was where Balak came from. Balak, it was on behalf of Moab trying to defeat these guys. Just before this, Edom had prevented Israel from going through their territory into the promised land. So Edom and Moab were fresh in the mind of the Israelites, but they would also be part of the local politics. Then there's the Amalekites and the Kenites. The Amalekites were the first people to fight Israel when they came out of Egypt, weren't they? They were the first battle that they had, and they were foes from that point onwards. And then there's the Kenites. The Kenites were a different type of diplomatic situation. They got in, they were part of the Midianites, the clan of the Midianites, and Jethro. Jethro was the father-in-law of Moses. That was his people, and they ended up traveling with and entering into Canaan with now the Midianites, the Kenites, the Amalekites, the Moabites, the Edomites. They were all kin of Abraham, weren't they? Amalek, his descendants came from Keturah, which was one of the second wife of Abraham. And then you've got Moab and Edom, which were like Edomites came from Esau, and the Moabites came from Lot. But after you get through these Edomites, Moabites, Amalekites, and Kenites, you start to see more global names. You see Asher. Okay, Asher was Assyria. You see Eber and QUITIM. Now, Eber doesn't get any other mention other than the table of nations in here. In fact, all three of these names, Asher, Eber, and QUITIM, are only ever found together in Genesis chapter 10, the table of nations. So what we've got is we've gone from local, we've gone from Abraham's family to the wider human family. Now, there's also a reference to Cain and Seth, which are place names, but here it's kind of hinting that the whole human family. Remember, there was a time where Cain and Seth, before the flood, were the whole human family. There's this idea that he's trying to bring a global controversy view here. Now let's look at these final three oracles. They are a very quick progression. Amalek was the first among nations. Now that doesn't mean it was the first nation that existed. It meant that it's the first nation that attacked you. But its end is utter destruction. When did Amalek come into utter destruction? Didn't it come into utter destruction in the time of Saul? Saul was commanded to go and destroy them utterly, leave no one. He did leave one, but that's another story. That was his unfaithfulness. Then there's Oracle 6. Enduring is your dwelling place. This is talking to the Kenites. To the Kenites it says, enduring is your dwelling place, and your nest is set in a rock. Nevertheless, Cain, the word from which Ken comes from, Cain shall be burned when Asher takes you away captive. Okay, so Asher is coming. When did the Assyrians come and take captive? We know that. That's a big part of Israelite history. So we've now gone to this point where the Assyrians are taking captive Israel. And then the final oracle brings us to, alas, who shall live when God does this? But ships shall come from QUITIM and shall afflict Asher and Eber, and he too shall come to utter destruction. There's a structure to these oracles. The pinnacle of these oracles is the fourth oracle. Okay, it's the one that mentions the Messiah. He's the star that's going to come. He's the scepter that's going to come. And then it jumps back. It jumps back again to kind of fill in the details of how we get to the Messiah. And that's where we've got these 5 oracles where they mention first Amalek will come and be destroyed, and then Assyria will come and take captive the Kenites. And if you take captive the Kenites, you're taking captive the people who they're living among, which is the Israelites. And then finally, the Assyrians, the ones who come and take the Kenites captive, are going to be afflicted by QUITIM. And that brings us to Messiah. So these nations represent the whole of the human family. They're representatives of the three branches of humanity. Mizraim, which was mentioned at the beginning of the Balaam prophecies, that's Egypt. Egypt is representative of the Hamites. Then you've got Asher, which is representative of the Shemites. And QUITIM is representative of the Japhethites. Eber is representative of all the other families that were mentioned, the Abrahamic families. God's people are always caught between the warring factions of humanity. And so that's where Eber comes in. So QUITIM is the last major power that is to be expected before Messiah comes. A local application, now there are some local applications for this prophecy. They take the idea that the QUITIM was the sea peoples, and they were coming against a local tribe, maybe the Israelite tribe of Asher, or it could have been just an Arab tribe. These don't fit because we're talking Table of Nations language here. Like many Old Testament prophecies, distinction is not made between the first and second advent, but these are events that would come before would happen before Messiah comes the first time. Now the ships of QUITIM represent here the power that conquers the Assyrian. Now they didn't conquer Assyria, but they conquered the ones who bore the names and titles of Assyria. The Persians carried the titles of Assyria in their king lists. Whenever they wrote a letter, they would say king of Babylonia, king of all of the places they conquered. So they were descendants of the Assyrians in a regal sense. Now let's come to Daniel 11. We're going to just be able to look at this now from a perspective of background being filled in. At the time appointed, this is the verse, at the time appointed he shall return and shall come into the south, but it shall not be at this time as the former or the latter. For ships of QUITIM shall come against him, he shall be afraid and withdraw, and shall turn back and be enraged and take action against the Holy Covenant. He shall turn back and pay attention to those who forsake the Holy Covenant. So who are these ships of QUITIM? The traditional Adventist interpretation deals with QUITIM as a vague Western powers and connects it to the Vandal invasions of Rome, the barbarians, specifically the naval barbarians. And these include Uriah Smith, William Miller. The Islam or Crusades view sees QUITIM as Cyprus and find fulfillment in the Battle of Lepanto, which was one of the late Crusades. This is in 1570s, in the 1570s. And this is some of the people who are going to be at the conference. Pastor Rosenberg, Dr. Gain, and the Doctors Juncker. So the Vandals, the weakness with the Vandals is that these don't really engage with Numbers 24, these interpretations. They don't engage with the type, the example that's happening in Balaam's prophecy. Now, even though the term QUITIM did embrace a wider view of the Mediterranean, it never embraced Carthage, which is where the Vandals deployed from. It also assumes a literal fulfillment of the second half of the chapter. It also has no clear link between Kition and QUITIM, or Cyprus and QUITIM. Yes, there was a place called Kition, but there's no evidence that this was the biblical QUITIM. It also assumes a literal fulfillment, and this interpretation jumps into the future before returning to 508. This is the kind of timeline under the Lepanto view. See how it's an unbroken progression from verses 20 to 23, bringing us up to 31 AD. And then it jumps way into the future to talk about the Crusades before coming back. So the verses 24 to 30 bring you up to 1753. Then it jumps backwards in time to 508. Why? I don't know. This has to be demonstrated. This is a failure for this interpretation until it's actually demonstrated that there's a reason for this to happen. Now, there are some proposals that have been made based on text linguistics, but these are very speculative. There's no clear rules for discourse analysis in this case. Okay, so in verse 29 it said, this time won't be like the former or the latter, this particular event. Did you see that? So in verses 5 to 19, there's the first conflict, north-south conflict scene. And in this, north is victorious. North comes out victorious. At the end of the chapter, there's verse 40 to 45. This is the final conflict scene between north and south. And this time, the king of the north is completely victorious. Not partially, but completely. What when it says it won't be like the former or the latter, it's saying that the king of the north is not going to be victorious this time. And so the ships of QUITIM come in and they thwart the power of the north.